Now, the move to soft variables, I'm not sure whether there was any intermediate steps or not, but the major move to so-called soft variables came when I was a director of the Digital Equipment Corporation. It had been started by two men who had worked for me at Lincoln Laboratory and at the Digital Computer Lab. And they asked me to be on their board of directors. And the original funding came from American Research, a venture capital group in Boston. I felt I didn't understand the nature of new company survival and growth well enough to discharge my obligations on that board. And I also felt that if there was anything to this field of dynamics that we were developing, I should be able to use it to at least inform my own position. And over a period of 2 years, and it was fully that long, I worked with various ideas and came up with a model that we probably may discuss later that dealt with the dynamics of new corporate growth. Now again, you see, this was very largely, the facts were out of my own observation. I had, throughout the building of computers and the management of the Lincoln Laboratory Air Defense System, I had had lots of work with corporations. I had had a lot of contact with developing new devices because I had corporations developing new devices that we needed. So that whole environment was something that I probably had as much personal knowledge of as anyone in any corporation. And so I could draw on this. And I'd also had extensive exposure to the idea that management and impressions and soft variables are probably far more important than the hard variables in determining what is going to happen. And so this first model dealt not only with the obvious things of number of people and inventories and backlogs, but that was probably not more than about 5% of that first model. The rest of it was all in the management, superstructure, the information flows that went from a company to the market and back again, usually ones that aren't being measured by anybody. The kinds of things that go on in the halls, in talking to people, in conferences. And that model actually started with things like the personalities of the founders and the attitudes they had that would lead to decisions. And furthermore, it was in some sense a learning model, because those goals that we talked about before, many of them evolved and were determined by the history of the organization itself. In other words, what had happened in the past was used to determine the goals for the present. And so there was a lot of that subjective, soft, variable work in it, which I had observed, I thought was very important, and which, generally speaking, people have found fairly persuasive as to what goes on in the real world. And then the model itself, when you change the parameters in it, when you change the policies in it, in ways that you could more or less identify with different companies, its behavior would change to be more or less like those companies. In other words, you start with impressions of what people do, how they're related, what information they use. You go through this inductive process of hypothesizing a theory, which the model is. Then you use it to see what you can deduce from it. What does that theory produce? And that model will produce most of the kinds of profiles you see in new high-tech corporations, those that start and fail, those that start and stagnate, those that start and grow with huge crises, and those that start and grow without crises. You have that whole range potentially within that model, depending on how you devise the policies. So that, in my own experience, was almost the culmination of the early history of my work in the corporate world. And then, yes.
You said earlier that it's not proper to try to model a system, that what you should do is select a problem and then try to model the system that applies to that problem. The first example, with the inventory oscillation, it was clear what the problem was. What was the problem in the second example? As you described it, it sounded like you were trying to model a system. So I wonder if this was the first example of that mistake, or if there was a problem you haven't told us about.
Well, I think the objective was to understand the differences in the historical growth patterns of such companies. In other words, what is it that causes such high-tech companies to evolve in such different ways? That was, I think, the reasonable statement of the problem. And then how much of a model you have to have becomes somewhat subjective. That model has in it 50 levels. It's a 50th order, highly nonlinear dynamic system defining something like 250 variables. I challenge students to just sit down and name 250 variables in such a company. They might be hard-pressed to do it, but those variables emerge in two ways. The stalks, the levels, I more or less see in the real world. And then the next step, and I always start with the stalks, the levels in a system. I do not start with causal loop diagrams. I think that is a very serious mistake for people to begin dynamics with causal loop diagrams. I'll come to that again later. But I start with the stalks that I want to look at, that I think characterize the state of the system under various circumstances. Then the next step is to say, all right, what's controlling the flows in and out of those? And in general, you have to control those with the stalks that you have identified. After all, as I said before, the flows are controlled only by the stalks. So now the question is, how does each flow, one by one, get controlled? And how does it respond to the existing stalks? And in that way, you evolve the structure of the system. Another one of those turning points, or open doors, came around 1968, when John Collins, who had been mayor of Boston for 8 years and who had grown up in Boston Democratic politics and was a lawyer, was appointed by MIT to a one-year position as visiting professor of urban affairs to interact with students, interact with the faculty, to advise the administration on the nature of the outside political world, and just make himself at home here when he decided he would not run for re-election. And it was through an interesting happenstance. Collins had had polio in the big polio epidemic in Massachusetts in the mid-50s, and walked with 2 arm canes, and needed an office in a building with automobile access to the elevator level. This was before the modern requirements for access, and the Sloan building, where the management school was housed then, was about the only building that had that kind of physical arrangement. And so he ended up there, and the professor next door to me was on leave, and so he ended up in the office next door. And it was out of discussions with him about his past in cities and my past in dynamics that we began to interact and trade our backgrounds. And I recognized that I was getting the same feeling in talking to him that I had come to recognize in corporations. And that is that what he told me was going on, what the problems were, and what people were doing to solve the problems sounded plausible on the surface, sounded reasonable, and yet I got that feeling they don't hang together underneath. Exactly what I had experienced many times in corporations, where there is some serious problem, people think they are doing something to solve it, perhaps what they're doing is causing the problem. So I said to Collins that maybe we should merge our backgrounds and see if we could do something about understanding cities. Collins, very much a man of action, and he said, all right, how do we do it? And I said, well, we've got to have probably 6 to 10 people who have had an extensive background dealing with cities as real cities. We don't want people that studied cities in the urban studies department. We don't want people that got their knowledge of cities out of the libraries. We want people who have been there, struggled with them, worked on the problems. And we would probably need them for a conference for a half a day a week for a very long time. We didn't know how long, and we'll see if anything emerges. And Colin's immediate answer was, they will be here Wednesday afternoon. And Colin's position in Boston at that time was that he could ask almost anybody in business or politics to give him their Wednesday afternoons for a year and get them. So he delivered the people for the meeting, a group about the size of this. And it was out of 6 weeks of those meetings, every afternoon being a wandering, unstructured discussion of everything that's going on in cities and what people are trying to do. And I was putting 20 or 30 hours a week in between those meetings trying to see some structural dynamic sense to what was being said. And out of it came the urban dynamics model, which we'll probably talk about separately. But that was the excursion, that was the opening into system dynamics in the larger social systems. And that in turn led to world dynamics, which we'll talk about next time, and also to the work that I'm doing on the national economy. It was the urban dynamics work that opened those two doors.